I'd just like to welcome everybody. It's my pleasure on this wet and rainy day to welcome you all to this afternoon's event, which is ADST's 2024 Distinguished Speaker event. And we're very privileged and honored to have with us our award-winning author and journalist, Steve Coll. And he will be introduced to you shortly by Robin Rafel. But I'm Susan Johnson. I'm the president of ADST for any of you who may not know here on the Zoom call. And I just have a couple of announcements before the introduction. And one is for ADST members, please don't forget that our business meeting portion of our AGM will take place on October 24th by Zoom. So just please put that on your calendar if you don't have it already. And I hope that you'll be able to attend. And then secondly, I would like to introduce ADST's new FSO Executive Director, Judy Moore. There's Judy. I don't know if at least people here can see you. We're really pleased to have her. She's just started. And it's an occasion to thank our outgoing Executive Director, Tom Sellinger, who's done a great job and is staying on with us. Yeah. Tom will be staying on with us with the blessing of the department for another year to head up our Century of Service initiative, which you'll hear more about, particularly if you come to the business meeting on the 24th. So Robin, now I'm going to invite you to come to the podium and do the introduction.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's really a great pleasure for me to introduce Steve Coll, who's really one of the most gifted and productive and relatable journalists of his generation. Steve was born here in Washington and went to high school in Maryland. But after graduating, he moved to the West Coast to Occidental College, where, of course, he was Phi Beta Kappa, and I'm sure many other awards given his talents. He's recently moved to Princeton, New Jersey, after spending some time in London. So he's not too far away if the trains work. I first met Steve nearly 30 years ago when he was the Washington Post bureau chief in New Delhi. And he went on to have a very successful 20-year career with the Washington Post, where he was a foreign correspondent and an editor and publisher of the sadly now defunct Washington Post Sunday magazine. In 2005, he became the second head of the New America Foundation, the think tank here in Washington, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. He then moved on to academia, where he was a professor and dean of the Columbia School of Journalism, position he held until 2022. Steve has written, by my count, 9 books. Is that right? 9 books. He's the recipient of 2 Pulitzer Prizes and a large number of other literary awards. I'm partial in particular to one of his early works on the Grand Trunk Road, which was very reflective of my early experience in South Asia. So I really like that book. He's perhaps best known for his Pulitzer Prize winning Ghost Wars, covering the period from the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan through the eve of 9/11. He documents the CIA's covert funding of the Mujahideen, which greatly enhanced the power of the Pakistani ISI next door, covering the Soviet withdrawal, the resulting civil war, and the subsequent fatal loss of U.S. interest in Afghanistan, including the very half-hearted and unsuccessful effort to find Osama bin Laden. He followed that with an equally exhaustive book, Directorate S, which describes the sort of never-ending cycle of U.S. policy reviews, which led nowhere and revealed a profound lack of understanding of the ground realities in Afghanistan. It also explains the dysfunctional relationship between the CIA and Pakistan's ISI, and the tensions between the U.S. and Afghanistan's President Karzai, who had begun to see the U.S. as an occupying power, as many in Afghanistan came to see us. Interspersed between these 2 books was a book on the bin Laden family, which was, fit into this puzzle nicely. His most recent book, The Achilles Trap, turns to the controversial war of choice in Iraq. He explains how the mutual failure of comprehension on the part of Saddam Hussein and the US leadership unfolded through many years, caused by limited information, incomplete information and confusion, confirmation bias, and the fog of intelligence. He paints a fascinating picture of Saddam Hussein that would be hard for most Americans to recognize, given what we hear in the mainstream media about Saddam Hussein. Those of us who've worked in South Asia and the Middle East know Steve primarily for these books, but his canvas is really much wider. He's written books on the fate of Getty Oil after the death of J. Paul Getty, the breakup of AT&T, the consequences of the 1980s deregulation of the stock market under Reagan, and the outsized power of ExxonMobil, which enabled it to have its own foreign policy and security policy abroad. Steve's books are comprehensive, meticulously researched, and also long. And I'm pleased to say that he's drawn a lot on ADST oral histories for his work. But as a diplomat, the most important point to me is that if we had known then what Steve has so ably explained about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq, we would have made different and wiser policy choices. So for those of you who've often wondered, what was Saddam Hussein thinking? Or what was the ISI thinking? Or for that matter, what was the CIA thinking? Steve Coll has some answers for you. So I'm very pleased to welcome Steve Coll to the podium.
Thank you, Robin. That was incredibly generous, and I'm so delighted to be here. Forgive the little rasp in my voice, but I'm just fighting something off. I was delighted to accept this because I'm really a big consumer of your oral histories and used them quite a lot for this last book, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But more broadly, I mean, Robin mentioned that we met one another years and years ago in New Delhi, where I was a correspondent and she was, I think, a political officer in the US Embassy. My experiences as a correspondent, which were the sort of preface to my ambitions to write big Russian novel-sized nonfiction about America and the world, influenced what I actually try to put on the page each time I take on one of these projects, in that I became very interested in diplomats and in embassies. I think they're a neglected part of the way America lives in the world. They're fascinating places, and the people who work there are bright and committed and interesting and don't get a lot of ink. And so one thing I've always tried to do is to keep diplomats alive in my stories. If I can find someone who's in an interesting place at an interesting time, but also to convey some understanding and respect about what the profession is and what it isn't, which was one of the things that came up in this Iraq book, which I'll get to in a minute. But anyway, I'm delighted to be here. As Robin mentioned, what I'm going to talk about is, for my kind of 20 minutes or so, is the origins and the central themes of this book about the origins of the US-led invasion of Iraq. And like a lot of the work that I've done, it arose from my experience as a field reporter. When I was a rookie Washington Post foreign correspondent, Saddam invaded Kuwait. I was in Karachi at the time of the invasion, got a phone call back in the days when you had to call on landlines and said, you're going to the Gulf like everybody else. And I spent 6 months waiting for the war to start, and then covered the war, was at Safwan when the truce was signed, and then went back to Iraq after the invasion as an editor and a correspondent. And so like all of you, I'm sure I had my own lived experience of the discovery after the invasion in 2003 that the premise of what turned out to be a tragic and costly war had been based on bad information and bad analysis. And of course, like all of you, I lived through the reckoning of that in Washington, which became a highly charged and politicized, and a place where journalism had a lot to contribute as well. But throughout all of that, not to change the narrative of reckoning in Washington. But to add to it, I always felt that there was a side of this mystery that was completely unexplored, which was, why did Saddam create the impression, not only at the CIA's, weapons directorate and analytical directorates, but with Swedish disarmament inspectors and with German intelligence and with lots of other people who were skeptical about US foreign policy at the time? How did he create the impression that he actually had weapons that he didn't possess? How did that happen? And what was he thinking, as Robin put it? And this is interesting in part because of the price he paid as well, right? So he lost his rule. He had managed to remain in power in a very rough and unstable country and neighborhood for a long time. This was the miscalculation that cost him his reign and then ultimately his life and his son's lives. So not a small an error on his part. And I had been wondering about that in different ways for a long time, having initially talked to some of the inspectors who went out after the invasion to try to get a grip on initially what was there, and then when they discovered nothing was there, why nothing was there. And I've been thinking about it, and then I discovered that the question might be answerable because, as it turns out, Saddam had tape recorded his leadership conversations as assiduously as Richard Nixon. And we had, the US military primarily, had captured these materials from his presidential office, including all these recordings of his leadership conversations, cabinet meetings, visitors with foreign delegations, inner circle meetings, all kinds of things. And they hadn't become public for a long time. Briefly, they became public, then they were withdrawn. And so ultimately, I filed a FOIA suit to get a batch of them, worked with other people to get other batches of them, and I was able to get a decent percentage of what's still out there to be seen, I think. And through that, was able to try to enlarge our answer to the question, why did this war unfold the way it did? So to give you a sense of where diplomacy fits in this and where presidents make scapegoats out of diplomats, I'll mention a few episodes along the way to give you a flavor of the book and maybe to tease out some of the themes. And then I really look forward to your questions. With a sophisticated audience like this, it's much better to get to the discussion quickly. One thing that I had to decide once I started listening to reading the transcripts of the translated transcripts of the tapes and sometimes listening to the original, though I can't really work in Arabic, I still wanted to listen. And I studied it well enough to at least be able to put earphones on. And so I had to decide where to begin. And initially I thought, well, I'll start with the end of the Gulf War. And because the 90s was when we demanded his disarmament, when he apparently did disarm, but then didn't come clean in a way that created all this confusion. So that's really the story. But I was interviewing a couple of people early in the project, and they said, no, you can't start. You got to go back to the 80s because this doesn't make sense unless you understand our relationship with him in the 80s. And so I did more reading and more reviewing of the materials and thought, yeah, that's right. So the book really starts with the opening that the United States forged with him in the early 1980s to try to build a sustainable partnership with Saddam by helping him avoid losing the war that he had unwisely started with Iran. And you can go to the Reagan Library, though our declassification system is broken and way too slow. A lot of the materials from that period are available. And you can see the White House in a panic in the spring of 1982 as the Iranians have counterattacked and are around Basra and looking like they're about to break out and drive on Baghdad. Khomeini has announced he's going to, hang Saddam by the nearest lamppost once he gets there. And at that stage, the trauma of the Iranian Revolution in American affairs was fully formed. Lebanon was on fire. Hostages were just about to be taken. And so this sense of a long conflict with Iran was central to thinking about the Middle East. And the idea that Iranian power would be extended by the conquest of Iraq was just too much to bear. So the thought was, what can we do? And after a lot of thinking about it, the idea was, well, let's send the CIA in to give him satellite intelligence about Iranian positions. And that's kind of where the book begins. And this liaison develops, and it has a diplomatic aspect, but mostly as an intelligence-led liaison. We give him a lot of material. He is from the beginning quite suspicious about our intentions. And one of the themes in the tapes is he's always telling his comrades, there's something fishy about what's going on here. First, his theory is that these photographs, which are giving decisive advantages to his military, that these photographs are doctored and that they're really just a trap. And his generals say, well, boss, of course, you're always right. But on the other hand, these Iranian units are on the other side of the mountain, as depicted in this photograph, and that has given us an enormous advantage. So we would rather not have this turned off if you can keep it coming. So he sort of reluctantly says, well, you watch it because one of these is going to be fake and we're going to pay a price for it. And then after that, he says, okay, maybe they're offering largely authentic information, but they're playing a double game. They're also offering this information to Iran. So don't be naive. They're trying to basically fashion a stalemate. They're not trying to aid Iraq. They're trying to fashion a stalemate. And, that struck his comrades as slightly more plausible, but still they were developing these close relations with Americans who were telling them otherwise. Chargés and CIA liaisons and DIs. No, we're not in Tehran. They're our enemy. We want you to end this war and at least go back to the status quo. We certainly are not trying to aid you in the conquest of Iran, but we are genuinely interested in developing a better partnership with you, and we are not in Iran doing the same thing. And then those of you with long memories, like we all have in this room, will remember a certain day in November 1986 when Edwin Meese, then the Attorney General, announced essentially what became known as the Iran-Contra affair. And my favorite tapes in the whole kind of group that I had were the ones of Saddam calling his people together the morning after this series of admissions by the Americans that in fact, oh, and by the way, all along he'd been telling his comrades that the Americans are collaborating with the Israelis to build up Iran because there is a three-part conspiracy against the state of Iraq that is made up of the United States, Iran, and Israel. And don't you understand that is as deep as the tectonic plates of this earth. It is unshakable. Well, that's not a good metaphor since tectonic plates shake, but in any event, you get the point. In any event, he had been advertising this collaboration, and it sounded, even to his comrades, yeah, yes, boss, you're always right. And yet they seem to be acting in good faith. And so he calls them all in after the admission of Iran-Contra, and he's joyful. He's just giddy. He is like the only person in the world who's not like surprised by this calculation that the Reagan administration had made. And he essentially says, I told you so, I told you so. Don't ever question my judgment about this again. This is the way of the world. And what's important about it, apart from, and there are in your oral histories, diplomats who had to go around, who were themselves surprised in Baghdad, and who were themselves surprised by this revelation, and who had been carrying the messaging that none of this was true, and had now had to go back and say yes, and then their cables, ring with their own disappointment, with all of why were we building this apparatus in Baghdad when it was inevitably going to be betrayed. And now our credibility is, close to zero. And yes, maybe we can build it back because the Iraqis still have an interest in what we have to offer them, but it's going to be a painful road. But the longer term impact of this is, it is striking in the 90s when you go through the transcripts of his conversations about the weapons inspectors and how much he intends to cooperate or not with the disarmament demands that he faces after the Kuwait War. He refers back to Iran-Contra. He refers back to it as an explanation for why he's behaving the way he does. He says, don't forget, there is a permanent structure and it is opposed to us. And we should not be naive about it. And there's no reason for us to be cooperating with people who are not interested in our rehabilitation. And anyway, it was more than just an episode of terrible judgment and terrible management of the NSC. It was something that did echo in his mind long after I think we had forgotten about its relevance. The second thing I wanted to mention is then an episode that is very particular to the profession of diplomacy, which was there's a long chapter in the book about the invasion, the run-up to the invasion of Kuwait, and it was quite a privilege to go back to that and go through it with more information. Saddam's side, which we can now see in full, and then our side with a little bit of distance, a little bit of new material on the record, oral histories, and other materials. And I tried to put together, a full and pacey, as they would say in the editing business, narrative of the period from when he started talking crazy in this early part of 1990 until he invaded on August 2nd, and how the two sides kind of drove right past the opportunity to prevent this. And at the heart of it is diplomacy, and David was, an important source and part of this history. But I particularly wanted to re-examine the role of our ambassador at the time, April Glaspie, who was thrown under the bus after the invasion and essentially scapegoated by the first Bush administration, which was generally, a lot more dignified and professional than that. But the politics of having failed to prevent the invasion were just too much for them to accept without casting blame on someone. And she was, one of the most visible and early female ambassadors in the Middle East of her generation. And institutional sexism, I'm sure, had a lot to do with how easy it became for them to blame her for this. But I thought, well, okay, but what are the facts? Let's go back through this, granularly and try to build a timeline of her instructions and what she was saying on the basis of these instructions, who wrote the instructions, how the instructions came out, and then I'll let you read the chapter. But in the end, I felt as if she was entirely that she was unfairly blamed entirely. That there was hardly a word that she uttered in her infamous meeting with Saddam that wasn't essentially written down as instructions that she had memorized. And also, when you go back and look at the structure of these conversations, these were filibusters by Saddam. He sits down, he talks for 45 minutes, and I'm sure she maybe gestured to try to, but there's only so much you're going to do. And then she had her turn to speak, and she basically, gave him the White House talking points. And what's interesting about it, though, when you really step back, because we all, I think, all remember this episode in one way or another. So why did they blame her? Why? What was the real failure? Okay, so the real failure was that the president, perhaps our most capable foreign policy president in the post-war period, and a decent fellow, and we should do so well. He was well prepared. He had all the right jobs beforehand, and he did a ton of things right during his presidency. Okay, I'm largely a fan, but in this case, he blew it because he did the thing that he knows how to do, which was he called all of the allies around Saddam as Saddam was threatening war and demanding outrageous recompense from the Kuwaitis, from the UAE, from the Saudis. Each of the Gulf kingdoms was trying to figure out how to deal with this. They were trying to assess whether he meant it or whether they could buy him off. One by one, the Saudis and the UAE said, okay, we'll pay you. And they relaxed a little bit. But throughout, what was George H.W. Bush doing? He was calling Hosni Mubarak, King Hussein in Jordan, King Fahd in Saudi Arabia all the time saying, what's going on here? I'm worried. Like, is this real? He looks like he's going to invade. He's mustering troops. And every one of them said, it's all a bluff. George, calm down. Stop it. You're only going to make things worse. If you go out there and you try your little military deterrence thing, you're just going to make things worse. So stop it. Don't do it. And he was like, look, I mean, King Hussein is probably the closest person to Saddam who's talking to me freely. And he's absolutely adamant that there's nothing going on here, nothing to see here. And the Kuwaitis were saying the same thing. The Kuwaitis wouldn't even allow the ambassador to go to the foreign ministry because they didn't want to provoke Saddam. They thought this was weather that was just going to blow over. So it's embarrassing. You know, you take advice in good faith from your closest allies, and it turns out they're dead wrong. And you miss an opportunity to issue a deterrence warning that if you had had the opportunity to issue it, might have been complicated to do. Our allies wouldn't necessarily have signed up for what we were going to say. But there was some deterrence warning that could have been constructed just unilaterally, if necessary, that would have maxed out, would have gotten Saddam's attention. And he did say afterwards, and I don't think that he was being facetious or cynical, he said, I didn't understand that you didn't want me to go in. I really didn't understand. And that wasn't April Glaspie's fault. That was the White House's fault. And, you know, because the guy was, you know, the president was paying attention, he was listening, but the advice he got was bad. And, you know, nobody, like happens so many times, the counterfactual, nobody put their hand up and said, what if they're all wrong? There is a scene where 4 or 5 days after the invasion, Bush is out in Colorado with Margaret Thatcher, and he's at somebody's house, and there's various transcripts. I forget exactly what they're, some of them are in the Bush Library. And Bush says, people are giving him a readout to go out and talk to the press. And they're telling him, you should go out and say, we had this right all along, Saddam is to blame. And he says, to his credit, no, we didn't have this right. We had it completely wrong. I'm not going to go out and say that. And then he says, the only people who told me that this would happen were the Israelis. And I didn't listen to them. So anyway, very interesting about how diplomacy works and how, you know, one thing that I was reflecting on, because I was telling the folks on the board that I was lunching with that I'm working now on against my better judgment, a 3rd volume of the U.S. Afghanistan misadventure about just the few years leading up to the fall of Kabul. And I was reading the transcripts of the McCall committee's interviews with mostly State Department figures. And you can see the politicization. I mean, there's a lot of good material in those interviews, and that part of the process, I think, was done pretty well in bipartisan spirit. But you can see the politicization of it. And it just made me think, because I was thinking about talking down here and thinking about Ambassador Glaspie again. I was thinking, you know, sometimes ambassadors just have to take the fall. That's the job. Sorry, you know, that's the job, you know. And elected politicians have another set of interests. And okay, if you don't have to lawyer up and go to jail, then if you just have to take it professionally, somebody's going to take it. And that's what, you know, that's kind of part of what goes with diplomacy. And it goes with some of the other professions too, if honorably conducted, military and intelligence. But yeah, it just made me think, yeah, it's true in our business too. Like sometimes as an editor, you just take the fall for your reporter's mistake. That's what you do. That's how you have to do it. And I think that's okay. I think it's just, you know, the way of the world. So the last thing I wanted to go through is the 90s, and I'll do that in 2 parts. Because this is all what we've just gone through in some ways, important prologue. The invasion of Kuwait, to me, the fact that it occurred, and then the war that followed, and the form of the termination of that war, with Saddam still in power, and decimated, but claiming victory. That is really the origins of the runaway train that leads to 2003. And one of the sources of confusion that is fundamental, which is where I began, which is So why did Saddam, what was he thinking? Why did he create the impression that he had weapons that he didn't possess? And even as a fairly close journalistic student of the story, I didn't quite understand how that unfolded until I went back and dug into it. So you'll recall that after the war, in the most unified period of its history, the UN Security Council imposed very harsh disarmament obligations on Saddam. He had to destroy his chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons materials, missiles that could fly beyond a certain distance, and all of the infrastructure associated with those programs. And the UN asserted the right to conduct inspections to enforce this disarmament. The carrot to him was sanctions relief, because crippling sanctions had been imposed immediately after the invasion. And so the equation was, this was a coercive disarmament. Although the inspectors didn't come in with armed bodyguards, they came with the authority of the Security Council. And Saddam had to tolerate their presence in ways that right from the start he didn't like. So the first batch of inspectors comes in the summer of 1990, after these demands are made and the format of how the inspections are going to be carried out is sorted out among the great powers and at the UN. And as the inspectors are coming in, Saddam has a decision to make. What am I going to do? They're demanding that I voluntarily destroy everything that I've spent the 70s and 80s building up. A lot of the infrastructure was dual use, chemical factories for industry as well as for weapons, biological facilities for all kinds of things, including medical purposes as well as for weapons. And he was reluctant. At the same time, he desperately wanted sanctions relief. So what we know he did, which is the source of all of the confusion that unfolded, is that he essentially told his son-in-law, his trusted aide, to go out into the desert in the middle of the night and hide everything that could be hidden and destroy everything that should be destroyed. You have this vision of him driving trucks out it's been documented. He drives trucks out into the desert and they just pour chemical weapons into the sand. He got rid of all of his considerable stocks that he built up for the Gulf War. And he did it did he keep any records of what he had destroyed? Did he keep any inventories? Did he keep any photographs? No, he did not. He just said, he didn't even tell his inner circle, the cabinet level inner circle, what he was doing. It was just a handful of people and his SSO, inner bodyguard that were given this task. And they did it like they did many things, ruthlessly and efficiently. They dumped a lot of the weapons into the sand. They broke up the missiles. They blew up the missiles. And they didn't keep any records about it. Now, why? So when the inspectors came in, they couldn't find anything. They found factories that were dual use. And eventually they found aspects of the nuclear weapons program that were too big to hide and too difficult to blow up, like these giant iron calutrons that the inspectors chased around. But for the most part, they couldn't find weapon stocks. And yet there was no explanation about what the history of these programs had been, when the stocks had been manufactured. Saddam's people just told them, we don't have any, we don't have any, we don't have any. And so why did Saddam set it up this way? Why did he unilaterally disarm without making it possible for the international system to verify this? He wanted sanctions relief. That was his principal motivation. I think it's a complicated question, and I think a couple of other PhD students could write whole theses about this and come up with perhaps different emphases than I will give you now. But I think there were several reasons why he behaved this way. The first was pride. He really was not willing to be humiliated in public. He was not going to willingly stand next to a bunch of Swedes in white lab coats as they systematically checked off the destruction of everything that he had built in the name of a greater Iraq. That would humiliate him in front of his own people. It would humiliate him in the Arab world. And he'd rather He'd rather go down fighting, as he demonstrated later. So that is a hard thing for us to kind of calculate sometimes, but doesn't mean it's not central. There were other reasons as well. He was just trying throughout to finesse complicated situations. He wanted he figured, and this was not a crazy calculation. I think he was getting signals from France and even Russia that if he could give them something to work with, they would go to bat for him on sanctions in the Security Council. But he had to display enough cooperation so that they would have something to work with. They were already getting a little tired of the New World Order and the triumphalism and so forth. And they were basically saying, but we can't do this with you still armed to the teeth with. And then in the summer, they discovered that he was pretty close to a nuclear weapon compared to people's expectations. And, we can't do this with you armed to the teeth. So you're going to have to cooperate up to a point. So he was trying to figure out, okay, how much do I have to cooperate before the French and the Russians start doing my work for me? And this is in the tapes too. Like he's just sort of saying, well, if they can't find anything, surely that's enough for Paris. And so there's a naivete about the kind of audit system of international disarmament inspections and how the politics of trying to prove a negative tend to evolve in disarmament equations. Why would you expect Saddam to think that through? But in any event, he got kind of what he wanted. The inspectors were a little bit puzzled. They're like, okay, there's no smoking gun. They kept looking for it. They kept saying it's just around the corner. They said that for 12 or 13 years. It's just around the corner. There's something so fishy about this because he had done this in such a disorderly way. But on the other hand, there was nothing to find because he had also destroyed everything that mattered pretty much. And so that was another big reason that he acted this way. Anyway, as time goes along, he gets into an argument with Tariq Aziz, his principal diplomatic representative, a professional diplomat, I think much respected by the people who dealt with him. And, of course, he lived large, had nice flats in Paris, complicit in the Saddam regime, but as a professional diplomat, pretty straightforward. And like professional diplomats, in every meeting, he's advocating for diplomacy. He's like, okay, these people are leading you down a crazy military path. That's not going to work. But if you just give me something to work with at the Security Council, I can bring the French and the Russians around. I'm sure of it, that we're just that close. And so he keeps asking Saddam for one more concession to the inspections because Saddam covers up the biological weapons program entirely for like 4 or 5 years. And then finally, Tariq Aziz says, look, I think we're just this close to getting a clean bill of health, or at least enough of one for the French and the Russians. And so just let's admit the truth about that, about the biological weapons. And he goes ahead and does it. And throughout, and this explains his original behavior in 1990, he keeps saying to Tariq, I'm going to do what you recommend, and I promise you it's not going to work. And you know why? Because this whole disarmament demand is a ruse. This is where he would refer back to Iran-Contra. There is no space for my Iraq in this world. I mean, he didn't use that language, but virtually the same thing. Because the Americans and the Zionists and the Persians, as he would often call them, they are bent on our destruction. And this game you're playing is just that. It will not result in sanctions relief. All they want is my destruction. They want me gone. That's what this is really about. So yes, many days he would come to the office and he wanted to believe that Tariq Aziz was right. He wanted to believe that he could get sanctions relief, start rebuilding, get the economy going, become more legitimate on the international stage, have more power in the Arab world, because that's how he had ruled for a long period before 1990. So he wanted to believe that it was true that there was a way out, but in his heart of hearts, as he would say, he kind of had this conviction that this was all a smokescreen for a regime change policy. Well, kind of like Iran-Contra, he turned out to be right. I mean, he turned out to be right. Madeleine Albright delivered a speech in 1997 that said, doesn't matter if he disarms, which also turned, I can have sanctions without all of these people coming in on authorized flights. So he threw them out. And, you know, we had that brief episode with the British of bombing him in December 1998 for 5 or 6 days and called it a victory. And then we were blinded from 1998 until 9/11 and beyond, at least until Anmavik got stood up in 2002. So those 4 years themselves created an enormous doubt about what we had missed. And those 4 years were part of the same cycle that goes back to our attempts to establish some kind of consistent transparency with him and never being able to overcome his skepticism. Look, I don't want to suggest that Saddam's conduct is in any way the responsibility of the United States, but we have to play our own hand, and to play it so clumsily and constantly contradict ourselves, that feeds into his, you know, transparent paranoia. And the last thing I'll say about the diplomacy part of this is, if you go back and read the cables, and I wish we had more of the cables in general, but if you go back and read the cables, our cables, you know, the UK's cables, French even, self-interested as they were, they understood who Saddam was. I mean, you go read April Glaspie's just basic primer for the secretary, or primer for, you know, the visiting assistant secretary. They understood what motivated him. They understood his obsession with Israel and Iran. They understood his grandiosity. They understood his pride. And yet somehow, you know, you write these cables into the system and they just bounce off the wall. I mean, they don't become a part of anybody's discourse. You go back and look at the notes in the NSC, and like, there is no discussion about what is Saddam thinking. There's only discussion about the kind of binary conflict that we're basically in, or a kind of rough calculation of what can we buy him with, not what might motivate him. So as I conclude, you know, as I was saying over lunch, one of the things about writing these books is that I spend years on the research, and I'm a grinder. It's not, you know, it's a character flaw. I think maybe some people in my life might say, I'll just keep grinding and grinding, and trying to get closer, you know, further down. And when I'm working that way, I'm really just trying to understand what happened, and also to try to understand the people who were making these decisions and where they were coming from, what their perspectives were. And I'm not trying to think about like what lessons can be drawn from this. Yes, at the end, I will block out in my narrative some bracketed things and say, you need to drop in here and tell people what to think about what's going on. But those analytical passages are really just a step back from the narrative. You know, like, this is why the failure to deter Saddam from invading Kuwait really mattered over the next 10 years. So I'll write a little mini essay about that, but that's still kind of inside the book. But then when you publish a book, everyone who interviews you and your publicist and everyone says, well, what are the big takeaways from this? Well, I don't know. It's history. I mean, you read it. you tell me. They say, no, that's not good enough. You have to have some takeaways. So then I have learned that I have to do this. So what I finished, and when the book comes out, I hate rereading my books. I mean, I put them on I think they're terrible. I put them on the shelf. I stare at them with disdain for like 5 or 6 years. God, well, that's terrible. Why did you? That's so embarrassing. I can't believe anybody liked it. And then, you know, after 6 or 7 years, on a rainy afternoon, I'll go pull one down and like open it up to read it. Not bad. It's okay. But anyway, now that I know what's required, I reread the book, skim read it one time, and try to think about, so what is there that jumps out? I mean, I don't know who I'm speaking to. I hate to give advice to people in government. I don't feel like I'm qualified for that, and I hate when journalists, you know, presume to know what policymakers should do. But I do think that as a citizen, I can say what I wish my government would take away from this a little bit. And one of the things that's so obvious, but is so central to this particular conflict, is that we didn't talk to our adversary. We didn't talk to our adversary for a long time. I mean, for like 10, 12 years. And why? Because of domestic politics primarily. I mean, there are these pretty on broadcast mode transcripts of Clinton's calls with world leaders that are now available in the Clinton Library. But there's moments of candor that they can't help. I mean, as a historian, I've learned that when leaders tape record their phone calls talking across oceans, that they're on broadcast mode. They figure they're probably being advised, like, you might as well assume the Chinese are listening to this. So why don't you just, say whatever it is you want them to hear? So it does kind of distort what you read years later on the record. But then these are people, and they kind of, some of them know each other. They start talking to each other, and they don't get into state secrets, but they start revealing themselves. And there's an early conversation between Clinton and Tony Blair. Tony Blair's just been elected, and they're obviously simpatico in their political strategies and outlooks. And Blair's just gotten into office, and Clinton's in his second term, so he's been dealing with Saddam, endlessly, and he's exhausted and frustrated. And he says to Blair, he says, "So, does anybody in your foreign office, are you guys talking to Saddam?" And Blair says, "Well, I don't know. I kind of just got here. I don't know. I honestly don't know, but I can ask, and I'll find out." And Clinton says, "Because if I could, I would pick up the phone and call the son of a bitch right now. But I can't, because I would get roasted by the Republicans. They would have me for lunch." And he goes on like that. I just can't do it. Well, okay, but does that mean you can't have a cutout do it? You can't build a channel? You can't make a habit of trying to figure out what your adversaries are saying and thinking? And if you think about what that contact would have produced in Saddam's case, okay, it wouldn't have solved the mystery of whether or not he had weapons, because there was lots of access that the inspectors had, and they still couldn't break it down. But if you got close to him, if you spent as much time in and around him, and if you got into his office enough and chatted with him and let him just ramble, you'd pick things up. One of the things that might have been picked up was that by the time we were trying to decide whether he posed such a mortal threat to the world that he needed to be overthrown at the price of a land invasion, he was not the same leader that he had been in 1990 or in the 1980s. He was in his 60s, and he had decided that he wanted to be a novelist. And he was writing novels. He was spending long hours of every day handwriting novels. He wrote 4 novels. And he was a lot of assassination attempts had gotten too close for comfort. So he generally was not going out very much, and he was moving around between his different places, but he was handwriting. And I interviewed one of his, he had like a combination press translation office, and they were his editors, his language mavens. And he saw himself as a man of letters. He was constantly subsidizing writers and having them come and talking to them as a fellow poet and so forth. But he decided the novel was where he really wanted to make his mark. And so he would write out these long discursive paragraphs that doubled back on themselves. He wrote this translator, editor who I spoke with, as he spoke, a lot of digressions, endless sentences, and looping back and then coming forward again. And so Saddam would send over these handwritten pages, and he would ask them to clean up his Arabic and then send back type pages that he could correct, like a lot of writers. And so they said, well, this could be clearer. So they started marking things up, and they sent them back. And then everything came back just as he had sent it in, not with no corrections. And then they reflected on how many times they wanted to correct his Arabic, and they decided, oh, it's perfect, just as written. Writers in general are sensitive, but I mean, to being edited. But yeah, Saddam, you wouldn't want to make that mistake. But what impression might have been made if an alert government was looking for insights about where Saddam was and and what might bring him around had been listening to him in this phase of his life. Maybe there wasn't a way out, but as a taxpayer, I just sort of wish that we didn't deprive ourselves of all of the information that might be available to inform, such consequential decisions. And to me, this kind of way, it's understandable as domestic politics. As a student of domestic politics, I get it. Domestic politics, especially these days, take no prisoners. But you have a duty. Your duty is to defend the Constitution, defend all of us. And so how can you deprive yourself of information on the basis of short-term, political interests that you need? You have to be, those are risks that are worth taking. And I think the American people would easily understand if you got kind of slightly embarrassed that you'd been holding a back channel and the whatever the opposing party was screamed at you for being naive. You could easily refute that by saying, no, I'm trying to make sure I have all the information I need. And so anyway, there are other things that I took away, but and you can discount this from the bias of a reporter. I believe that we talk to everybody. We talk to mass murderers. We go into prisons and talk to people. We talk to everybody because we want to know as much as we can, not because we feel morally compromised by talking to bad people. I mean, it can be icky sometimes, but it's still worthwhile. We know that the public is served that way. Anyway, thanks for your patience, and I really am looking forward to your questions in the discussion. Jada.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Steve. I'm going to start with a couple of questions from our online audience, and then we'll alternate with questions from the floor as well. And I'm going to kind of go in reverse order because these sort of chronologically go the opposite way. Question from Rick Olson. He says, I arrived in Riyadh in late July 1990 as a Paul Mill officer. I remember that in my consultations in Washington in July, and indeed my previous 6 months of Arabic training, that the ascendance of Iraq as a regional problem was widely known and widely discussed. The Arabic press was full of stories to that effect. So what was common knowledge to Arabs and Arabists somehow did not get transmitted to our respective leaderships. Do you care to comment on that? And then another question that jumps forward a little bit. Why do you think the US analysis was so bad? What should the NSC have done differently? Seems to be the same failure with US intel and analysis in terms of the current Russia-Ukraine war. CSIS just did a panel asking the same questions about problems with US intel and analysis and hence action. The panelists, including Phillips P. O'Brien, were also critical of the news media's role in not asking their guests, aka the experts, the hard questions. Care to comment on either of those?
Yeah, sure. So on the first one, I mean, I urge you to read the chapter in the book that goes through this, but you're right. I mean, Ambassador Olson is right that there was an enormous amount of noise in the Gulf in the summer of 1990 around Saddam's threats. His threats were explicit. They were delivered I think he traveled to Amman at one point and delivered some of them. He sent Tariq Aziz and some of his more thuggish henchmen to various meetings. And Mubarak in particular was trying to facilitate a mediation. But what was at issue was Saddam's demand that he be forgiven the loans that he had received from the Gulf kingdoms to fight the war against Iran, and that these be turned into grants. And his rationale was, again, as was often the case with him, not crazy, which was, I fought this war on your behalf, people. This is setting aside the fact that he started it unnecessarily and unprovoked. But once it got going, the Iranian Revolution was a threat to you, and I, kept them off of your shores, and I made an enormous sacrifice in lives and expenditure on your behalf. And yes, you lent me some money. What else did you do? Nothing. And so. And by the way, these sums, 20 billion here, 30 billion there, would it kill you to give those to me as grants? Because I've got a lot of rebuilding to do. I've got a huge standing army I need to demobilize. I've got an economy that's in tatters. So he made those demands. And then when people didn't immediately capitulate, he called it economic warfare. You're waging economic warfare against me because you're afraid of me. You think that I'm coming after the Arab world, which they were, some of them did think that, and for good reason, as it turned out. But each of them had to calculate how to deal with this essentially an extortion demand. And the Saudis and the UAE didn't share a land border. Well, the Saudis did, obviously, but the UAE didn't share a land border with them. They held out for a little while, and then they both capitulated. They both said, yeah, we'll convert these to grants. And he said, fine, I'm no longer at war with you. But the Kuwaitis held out. There's a pretty good oral history conference, more about the Iran-Contra legacy, but I think Tom Pickering was there. It might have been him or another Arabist, an Arabist from the State Department was there. And somebody just said, the Kuwaitis, they were meticulous bankers. And they really didn't like to take these loans off their books. And they didn't expect to get paid back. They knew that Saddam was not going to ever repay them, but they just didn't like the idea of making a public display out of forgiving a loan because they thought it would come back at them. And for good reason. I think they were constantly feeling like everybody was after their money. They were constantly under pressure from people to, a lot of suitors. And so, like, in principle, it's a good idea to show people that when, you make a loan, it's a loan. And that's, and so that was their miscalculation in part. And then they also miscalculated that this was all just a bluff, and that, it would pass. Oh, and so the second question about, lot there to chew on. I do think I felt, because I was working on this book, finishing it around the time of the invasion of Ukraine, it made me desperate to hope that Putin had recorded his leadership conversations the way Saddam did. Because I have a feeling that they would probably be just as revelatory about what we didn't understand. This is the hardest thing, having humility about what you can't see. It's an important part of journalism too. But in any event, there's a lot there to unpack. That's for another day in somebody else's book. But I do think that errors in judgment are part of the human condition. So you can't expect your government to not make big mistakes. The government will make them. The question is, like, as a taxpayer, as a democracy, gifted this system of government that we have the opportunity to perfect and re-perfect and refine, and to do it in a fairly open and transparent way with competitive ideas. I mean, gifted this. What can we ask of ourselves by way of, like, process? Like, what should be the basis for decisions? And then if we feel like we have had an honest and complete and really, kind of balanced the inputs, as they would say, then let's accept that we're part of the human condition and we'll make mistakes. What's so frustrating is we repeat the same errors over and over, and they're process errors. They're decision-making, they're systemic decision-making errors. And anyone who's had a leadership position, even in a small institution, understands that good process leads to good outcomes. Not all the time, but more than bad process does. And if you just try to do it all yourself, or if you don't listen, if you ignore the people who you kind of annoy you and you don't want to listen to them, you will make mistakes. You will just make mistakes. You have to listen, and you have to collect as much information as possible and listen to other people's analysis of it and do counterfactuals and try to get to the best place. Now, if you allow yourself to be paralyzed, of course, that's not a good outcome either. But to see how our system, because of its unwieldy size, has settled for this least common denominator process, NSC, interagency process, where every department gets its own kind of lane to run in. And there isn't really proper, there often isn't the kind of fully informed deliberation, or there is a sort of politicized kind of pressure on the system to come to basically paper up an outcome that's already been decided in advance. I mean, talk about this Afghanistan book I'm working on. I mean, what did it feel like for the people involved in the Afghanistan policy review in the first couple of months of 2021 who knew what the outcome was going to be? And how many meetings did they have? And how many papers were generated? How many intel briefings were given? And then now we can, Frank Foer's book is pretty good. I think it's, it has this kind of humiliating picture of the president basically having the chairman of the Joint Chiefs get a little bit of airtime and express himself so that the president can feel like he checked a box and makes a decision that he'd already made. And, I don't want to be that harsh, but that's kind of what the record shows. And how often does that happen? How often do people go to meetings where, they already know what the outcome is and things are just being papered up? And then your department or your office is going to be put in the position to carry out something that's partially, a facade for something that's been decided elsewhere in a political way. And that's not a healthy way to run a railroad. It's hard for people who are in those positions of responsibility to do their jobs with integrity when that's the situation. And then, of course, we have this, either you resign or you find some way to do your duty. And that's also not a great way to organize.
Thank you. My name is Mark Feldman. I just want to say what a wonderful experience it is listening to you, and how grateful I'm sure we all are for the books you've been writing. I have a question, but I have to make a disclosure. The question I would like to ask you to address now is how is it that Saddam did not understand that we were coming in when we did come in? The disclosure is that I wrote an oral history for ADST and published a book on it. But they published, the book, which touches on a lot of the things you've been talking about from a very different perspective as an alumni of the State Department legal office. My the clients and associates had me at the table, so to speak, on issues relating to the run up to the Gulf War, which we could discuss another time. But I'd like to hear, and one last disclosure. During the run up to the Iraq War, I was sitting in P at DOD as a part-time consultant at a time when everybody in the building knew that we were going in, but that was not a public position of the administration. But surely Saddam must have understood that.
Well, I mean, we have a pretty good picture of this from his records. There's more kind of memos of conversations and notes of meetings than there are audio from that period, but there's a lot of contemporaneous notes of conversations that he had with his cabinet, with others. And essentially, he did not believe we were coming in until very late. And he did not prepare, partly because he was distracted by his novels. He was planning a musical for one of his novels during this period, but partly because he had been conditioned by, I mean, this is maybe too full of a statement, but he had been conditioned by his experience since Kuwait, which was that he repeatedly mustered forces against us. We repeatedly mobilized aircraft carriers and forces against him. And what happened was we hit a few empty buildings with cruise missiles for several days, sometimes more than that, and they had to go underground for 4 or 5 days, and then they come back up. He had a conviction that we would not bear the casualties that would come from a ground invasion. And he thought that our behavior since 1990 demonstrated that we were all bark and no bite when it came to a land invasion. So as it became apparent that the rhetoric and some of the visible force movements and so forth suggested, and the deadline setting, the ultimatums that were being given were getting serious, he still, quite late, kept saying to his comrades, they're not going to come in on the ground. They're going to bomb us. and it may be worse than anything we've dealt with before. It might last 6 weeks, but it's going to be like, and he didn't use this, but I think what he had in mind was the bombing of Yugoslavia during the Kosovo War, like an air campaign that would last for 6 or 8 weeks. And so he prepared to go underground, and he prepared for dispersal, but he didn't prepare his army to oppose a land invasion, and until very late. And the best measure of what of his thinking was what he did with the, I think, $20 billion in cash that he had in his central bank. And his people started saying in like November or December 2002, boss, do you think we ought to move that out of the bank? Like, because I think they're going to probably go there if they get to Baghdad, and it'll be chaotic. And he's like, no, they're not coming. They're not coming. And then in like January, he says, okay, box it up, but don't move it yet. And then it's like only the beginning of March where he says, okay, I think this is actually happening. So let's get it out of, put $1 billion over there and $1 billion over there. And in any event, I think his distraction is more of the explanation than anything else. He really was not paying attention to his job at this point. And there are transcripts of his addresses to his military forces at the point where it's pretty clear the Americans are coming in, and he's coming around to it. And he comes up with these, back of the napkin defense plans that have no grounding in military science. I mean, that was unfortunately true of his leadership in the Iraq War, which was why he did so poorly. He thought he was a tactical general, and he was terrible at it. But this was even more comical, like color-coded schemes and so forth. But his basic idea was one of nostalgia. He said, we're going to go back to being guerrillas, just like we were in the early Ba'ath Party days. We were a clandestine force that captured Iraq and made it great. And we're going to have to become a clandestine force again, and then we'll capture Iraq and make it great again. And he basically issues these instructions to people. It says, you should learn to ride a horse. And by the way, at least learn to ride a motorcycle. And I know how to ride a motorcycle, and because that's going to be when the insurgency developed, the Sunni insurgency developed after the invasion, of course, our official narrative was these are just dead enders. There's no organizational aspect to it. And it was not well organized. And Saddam was, of course, captured in December. But in fact, that vision was the only strategy that he offered to everybody under arms who was about to be disenfranchised. That vision was, and maybe they didn't have a lot of other alternatives, but he told them, he tried to get them fired up. He said, you can do this. You can win this war. And I'll disappear, and maybe occasionally I'll surface to give you further instructions. And
Thanks. I'm Dan Whitman. I've worked in and around ADST, and I was Foreign Service. There is a story, maybe apocryphal, that during the Iran-Iraq War, some years before, when things were going badly for Iraq, that Saddam Hussein met in Vienna with an American official, maybe Donald Rumsfeld, who said to him, remember the chemical weapons we gave you? We now authorize you to use them. Is there any truth to that story?
I didn't encounter anything like that. Donald Rumsfeld came to Baghdad twice. We saw Saddam one of those visits. And we were, you don't need a secret meeting in Vienna to see that we were tacitly accepting his use of chemical weapons against Iran. We didn't like it. I don't see evidence, at least nobody wrote down a conviction that this was a winning weapon for Iraq. He thought that it was. For the United States, the central thing was to keep him in the fight and to make sure that he didn't lose. And at the peak of his use of chemical weapons, he was still in danger of losing because his tactical performance, the politicization of his generals, even though he had excellent equipment, he didn't have decent military leaders at any level, NCOs or majors or generals. And so he was using chemical weapons to defeat the human wave attacks because it was difficult to use conventional weapons to defeat those. But I think he also just generally decided that they were weapons of prestige for him, that they were weapons of fear, and that they were winning weapons. And, you know, if you want to know kind of what our government's position about that really was, I mean, there's a well-documented meeting when Tariq Aziz, we normalized relations with Iraq in December 1984, and they maintained an embassy, and full embassy in Washington up until the Gulf War. And at times, Tariq Aziz, as foreign minister, would visit. There's a meeting where he comes in. The Reagan administration had to deal with a Democratic House, and I don't know who controlled the Senate at the time, but there was a lot of criticism of their tolerance of Iraq's use of chemical weapons, legislation that was moving that was going to shut down aid to Iraq and on this basis and so forth. So the Reagan administration had to make a lot of public statements saying that they deplored Saddam's use of chemical weapons and that it was unacceptable and it was not American policy and so on. And this was also a way of preserving the norms that we would prefer to see around the world and our own obligations under the Chemical Weapons Treaty. But there's a meeting where I think it's Tariq Aziz, or maybe it's the deputy secretary, who comes into the State Department, and he's going into a démarche type meeting, and he meets a counterpart at the kind of deputy assistant secretary level, and the American reads out a démarche about how awful it is that they're using chemical weapons and how they need to stop. And then after that, George Shultz does a drop by, comes in, puts his arm around him and says, "We really want close relations with you. Please don't misunderstand what we're saying in public. And I'd love to see Tariq Aziz in Paris next month." So, I mean, that's probably more professional than a secret meeting in Vienna where we say, go ahead and bombs away. But the clarity was, I think they correctly understood at that point that if they wanted to make themselves understood in Baghdad, they had to be very direct about what they were saying, because Saddam was so susceptible to his own kind of interpretations of things that were way off the charts.
Bill Primosh, I don't have a Middle East background, but there are two statements I wish you could comment on. One, CIA Director George Tenet was reported to have said at apparently a principals meeting, it's a slam dunk that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. And then Secretary of State Colin Powell gave the speech at the United Nations, and it was publicized. It was broadcast on CNN. I saw it in an airport, in which he talked about biological weapons and aircraft that they've detected that would spread biological weapons. What's the basis for this? What did you find out about those two statements?
Well, I mean, none of that ages well. I mean, none of it is subject to revisionist judgment, I don't think. There are subtleties about each of them that are interesting to people who know the way the world works inside. I mean, in Tenet's case, that was an Oval Office meeting after the flawed NIE had been created, right? So there was the whole DI system of weapons analysis was filled with findings of various kinds of certainty, but generally high, that Saddam had chemical weapon stocks, that he had a biological weapons program and probably stocks. And they were a little more cautious about the nuclear program, but they noted that nuclear weapons scientists were still living well, and probably reconstitution was either underway secretly or would be if he had the opportunity. That was kind of the sense of it. But that NIE had been produced. It was itself a copy and paste job from various analytical reports that had been produced in the late 90s and into the early 2000s. So all that raw material, the slam dunk judgment wasn't about the finding of George Tenet. It was what the institution had produced in voluminous detail for 4 or 5 years. and that had also recently been summarized as the NIE. So that meeting was about selling. It wasn't about the substantive judgment. That probably makes it even ickier, but it was a meeting to try to help the White House understand how they could communicate successfully to a somewhat restive public about the seriousness of the threat that Iraq posed after 9/11. And so it was a discussion about, like, so what can we say? And the director turned the meeting over to his deputy, John McLaughlin, quite a, career analyst, quite a calm character. And he kind of went through the talking points, and, they sounded kind of flat. and the president was like, I think the president is quoted as saying something like, the average Joe or lunchbox Joe is not going to understand what you just said. And so what Tenet was saying was, Mr. President, we can do better than that. We can make a sharper presentation. It's a slam dunk. In other words, the case that we have to sell is a slam dunk. So that's where that came from. On the Powell speech, I think there really is an even more cautionary tale there, which is how intercepts dazzle people in a way that is fundamentally something that you should be very careful about. And journalists get just as excited about them as Joe Citizen, but there's something exciting about listening in on supposedly secret conversations. But I've had analysts, intelligence analysts, come to my class to try to educate my young graduate students. And they just use illustrations from, like, suppose you eavesdropped on your teenage son talking to his friends, and you got a transcript that sounded like this. And just look at the transcript. You might think that something apocalyptic was about to happen. But turn it around and just think that they are constantly BSing each other, or they're constantly performing in some way that has no basis in reality because they're teenagers. And, like, do you pause to consider the alternative to what it says on its face? And so it turns out, in the case of those intercepts that were played in front of the world, that what was being said was about a profound misunderstanding that developed in our system about coercive inspections. Because we developed late in the process, we developed a theory that the reason we couldn't find anything after 7 years of looking was that it was hidden in presidential sites. It was hidden in, the NSC. It was hidden in places that we weren't accessing. So we developed a plan to basically barge in under UN auspices. Somebody said it would be like the equivalent of a UN inspection team coming to the gates of the West Wing at 10:30 unannounced and saying, we're going inside to look at Sandy Berger's safe. We're going to open it up and we're going to read all the documents that are in there. And then we see the Secret Service scramble to say, no, you're not. And they go in there because they're under UN supervision and they're notionally cooperating. Instead of shooting at these guys, they just go in and they grab all of the things in the safe and they move them away so they can't be found. So what were they protecting? They weren't protecting WMD. They were protecting state secrets as defined by Saddam's, inner regime. So you have all these eavesdropping transcripts of people saying the inspectors are coming, clean up the site, move the stuff, get the stuff out of the way. And of course, in the presentation, it sounds like they're hiding weapons. In fact, they're just doing their jobs, trying to prevent the inspectors from finding things that, in the judgment of the Saddam regime, are none of their business. So it's just an example of how the kind of sexiness of SIGINT, which is constantly part of our national discourse now. I think that wasn't even supposed to be, like, SIGINT used to be a forbidden word. Now everybody talks about it. It's on, like, TV half the time that there's a show. Who's got the SIGINT? And, it's a mirage. Yes, of course, it can be enormously and uniquely important in intelligence collection and in counterterrorism and other things. I can overstate my joking, but let's have it. There is no perfect source of information in this world. There just isn't. So it's just a question of how imperfect something is and how many ways you can surround it to satisfy yourself that it's accurate in the ways that matter.
I'm going to squeeze in can I squeeze in a couple?
Maybe you have to ask our speaker here because he's already.
Well, I can do one more question. Yeah, and I'll turn it back to you.
I'm going to squeeze in just a couple from online, from our friend John Gleb at the Department of State Office of the Historian. He asks if you could say a few words about the value, broadly speaking, of oral history records like ADSTs or the Saddam tapes. What kind of perspectives can you glean from them, but not from other kinds of sources? And then a quick one on INR from Leon Weintraub. Seems that conventional wisdom is that state INR got the WMD story right, while other intel agencies got it wrong. How did the small INR outsmart the other big guys?
Well, on the first one, which brings us together, I think, oral histories are distinctively valuable. I mean, for me, and I think for tons of other historians, I think professional historians, maybe I don't have a PhD, so I'm never going to be in the club fully, but I try to operate to a lot of their standards. But they make deep and persistent use of oral histories because there is no substitute for several things about them. One is the narrative of direct diplomatic experience that each subject delivers. It's a fascinating way to understand what diplomacy is, what diplomacy in a particular administration looked like, what careers look like. I mean, that is amazing. And I just am a creature of institutions. So I like to read every page, even if it's dull, because I know that I'm learning something about how the world works. So these are career narratives that I think are just innately valuable that way. For what ends up on the page of a book, I was saying at lunch, one thing is the landscape of experience. There is no other place, nobody cables about the air conditioning situation in Baghdad. But people will want to know, like, what the conditions were in this ragtag, sort of facility that American diplomats were in, and people who have been there, they have vivid memories of personal and professional experience that are often quite colorful and funny. They remember the stuff that you tell your grandchildren about, and there's no other place to find that. And to liven up, to give truth to, human truth to the unfolding of political and diplomatic and military history, you need that. You need something, you need specificity, you need humanity. Otherwise, it just feels like a kind of a position paper. And then there is the history itself. I mean, because our declassification system is so broken, frankly, oral histories give a little bit more of a first bite at some of the basics about even like, what is our policy? What was our policy? What were your instructions? I mean, people don't go into chapter and verse, and there's nothing like those cables when they come out. But in the absence of them, it offers a source you can't get anywhere else. And, frankly, because I went back to the 80s, a lot of the people who I would have wanted to hear from were gone. They had passed. And yet these histories were, incredibly rich and energetic and lively. What was the second? Oh, INR. I mean, INR has gotten enough press for getting one thing right. I mean, they come on. I mean, yes, the aluminum tubes was a big avoidable error, and they were on the right side of that. Good for them. But that's not why we invaded Iraq. So, all right. Thank you.
That was great. That was great. Thank you so much for doing this. And when this book came out, I told Robin, I said, this is something that every junior Foreign Service officer should read. And even after 43 years in the Foreign Service, I found some of it shocking, but extremely enlightening. So here's what I found, and what we should talk to junior officers about: the extraordinary lack of understanding about what was going on and the extraordinary lack of personal contact. And I wondered, as a former ambassador, if April Glaspie, who I think had seen him once before, had the opportunity for more consistent contact, if she might have made a more personal judgment. I don't know. And but there was such a lack of understanding on our part, and a shocking lack of sources on the CIA's part. I think you say in your book they had something like 2 sources in Iraq. So millions of dollars, billions of dollars spent in intelligence collection, no doubt intercepts, which can be very misleading. The second thing was a point you brought out, which I would say is slightly different, and I would call it the remaining superpower syndrome. And it got very, very pronounced after the Soviet Union fell. And you talk about the process failures, but we became very powerful and very insular. And as our late colleague Jim Dobbins put it, for most of our career, the American was the most important person in the room. So you seldom had to think. And frankly, Washington wasn't much interested in what the foreigners thought, except for the 26-year-old in the CIA bioshop. And this means, of course, there were many people, as Rick Olson says, Ambassador Mack here, Ambassador Newman, some of our most distinguished colleagues are here. It doesn't mean there aren't a lot of people who understand this part of the world, but it was largely ignored as these decisions went forward. So I thank you for this. I hope you'll come back and talk to people that are just starting out, because this remaining superpower syndrome, our superpower status, is slipping somewhat. I hope you'll come back and talk to younger Foreign Service officers who can really benefit from this book and the insights and really the profound implications for what happened. So thank you very much.